Welcome to the Medicine Path podcast. I'm your host, Brian James. On this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Ryan Westrum. He's a nationally recognized psychedelic integration expert, and for more than 15 years, his primary focus has been working with individuals and groups, facilitating experiential therapy and integrating psychedelic journeys into healing and personal transformation. Ryan is a registered integration therapist for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and is the co-author of the book, the Psychedelics Integration Handbook, which is the primary focus of what we'll be talking about today. Hey, Ryan, thanks for joining me and welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Brian, it's a pleasure. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Can you start just by letting people know where in the world you are right now?
Yeah, I am a clinician. I'm a transpersonal psychologist and a licensed marriage family therapist out of Minneapolis, Minnesota in the US, and have been practicing here locally for the last 7 years and clinically throughout the United States for the last 15, and really make my home with COVID now and the Zoom world across the United States and some parts of the world, helping integrate psychedelic experiences.
Great. So you're in Minneapolis. How's the mood in Minneapolis these days? We're just coming up on a year anniversary of what happened to George Floyd and everything that happened afterwards. So just curious, what are things like where you're at now?
It's a really, really compassionate question, and I thank you for that. My office was literally 3 blocks away from where that happened. So we had quite the trauma. And culturally speaking, it really has been the epicenter of a lot of wonderful transformation under this tragedy. And very, very still kind of putting back the pieces. Post offices are still, they were burned down. Lots of buildings, lots of communities, lots of business establishments no longer exist. So really a lot of recognition and stark reminders of the dissonance we're living in right now, which leads a lot of the conversations I've been having both in my office with psychedelics as well as cultural and just trauma that we all are living under in our society.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I guess you're seeing this topic come up more for people in your clinical work. Are you finding that people are more open to looking at working with psychedelics based on the kind of the extent of the trauma that the collective is experiencing right now?
I have noticed that. And Brian, when you bring that up around the collective, it has what I would call an and. And what I mean by that, it's not or. We're not working with cultural, archetypal, or individual. Sure. We're working with them quite often simultaneously. And I'm seeing a significant parallel process of both the archetypes, the collective, as well as how it's being superimposed and reflected in their internal story. So a lot of family constellation work, a lot of generational trauma is coming out in integration work, as well as what's happening in the here and now. And it's quite a new revelation from my vantage point to see this confluence or the intermingling of both the archetype and the individual healing.
Yeah, interesting. Before we get too deep into the transformational journey, just to give a little background on yourself and how you came to this work. The name of this podcast is The Medicine Path, and I see that as the individual's journey to healing, growth, and transformation, and how it's unique for all of us. So I'm always curious, when speaking with someone like you who it's kind of doing similar work to what I do. I'm curious how you got on that path and when that happened for you. So maybe the first question is, when did you first get interested in psychedelics?
Oh, fantastic. I appreciate the softness and levity. We go in psychedelics, we're quick to go into the archetype. So thanks for bringing us back into the here and now. It's always good, Brian. Honestly, it was very early on. I was a young teenager, almost 13, when I first found psychedelics through some older friends. And synchronistically, I'm aging myself. It was very close to pre-internet. And so I had books fall in my lap. And the three books that fell in my lap was The LSD Therapy by Stanislav Grof, Interpretations of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, and then The Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe. And so this is the smorgasbord of really how I've made the medicine path. All along the while having this pretty outlandish experience with psilocybin, being fostered by 16-year-olds. Grateful that I had the safe set and setting of kind of intuition and listening and reading some of these archetypes in Grof and Wolf. And so I'm a real smorgasbord and smattering of the Grateful Dead, of psychology work and the interpretations of dreams, and kind of just started to follow like what was the next breadcrumb. And it's always funny that way. It wasn't like, oh, I have this revelation, I'm going to be a psychologist that works with psychedelics. But it was like, I'm going to feel into this. This feels right. This feels intuitively inclined.
Yeah, well, aging myself too, my first experiences were in the 90s. So definitely pre-internet, not a lot of information out there. And psychedelics were very much a part of the counterculture or the alternative culture that I was very much a part of, being a musician and into the beat poets and really anything kind of out of the ordinary, anything out of my kind of blue collar suburban upbringing was interesting to me. And so psychedelics were a doorway into that whole world.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you that was very similar is it was a draw, but yet there was enough taboo that actually brought me into it, and yet kept it kind of like, okay, it's not as fluid as it is today. It was like still this kind of feeling into what is appropriate, and yet still curious, and yet, you know, you still heard stories of if you did LSD 3 times, you were going to be clinically insane. So, you know, you didn't have Reddit to clear up your, you know, folk tales that people would tell you.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah. Yeah. For me, it feels a lot like just kind of stumbling around in the dark, trying to find my way. And through that, having some really traumatic experiences, but then also some experiences where I had that, you know, taste of the larger possibilities for me, or the taste of freedom from the suffering that I was experiencing. So enough to kind of keep me curious and keep me going. But you hit on something that resonates with me, in that because it was part of the counterculture, that was probably one of the things that drew me into it. And if it was as mainstream as it is now, I might not have been so interested. I would have been maybe going down another path, you know?
Yeah, it's cool enough to be interested, but it wasn't like, oh, and if it becomes too like, and it's, I'm making fun of myself, but there was definitely this give and take of, okay, there's enough unknown to it to really seek out, to keep exploring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what were some of the pivotal first experiences that you had that let you know that there was something more to be explored here?
There was a pinnacle moment in one of my first psilocybin experiences, Brian, where I internally remember being out in public as the young teenage and irreverent person I was, recognized I need to bring this into a higher level of sanctity in spirit, and was asked to bring myself home. So someone brought me home. I had a sober friend bring me back to my home. And I remember spending the entire experience, or what I would now reference as a session, going in and out of going inside the womb and outside the womb by covering myself in blankets. And I'm young, so there was no cartography. And yet you're sitting there experiencing the divine, all the while going, okay, I'm still here on planet Earth. And I knew in that instant, and so grateful for you referencing this. What changed was the idea of, okay, this isn't just a toy. This isn't as you going to a festival and seeing lights and trees melt. This is much more of a divine spiritual openness that I ended up just taking on for what now is my entire career.
Hmm. And so was it those first experiences that led you to become interested in psychotherapy and psychology?
Yeah, the idea of psychotherapy and psychology, I vividly was asked from the school counselor, "What do you want?" And I had the intermixing of philosophy and psychology, and it was really catalyzed by psychedelic work. So the whole entire time, I'm playing Division I hockey at a university while I'm still exploring my consciousness. And I knew at every given moment I had these wonderful experiences with psychedelics that there was something more to it. And it continued to be endorsed by places like MAPS, by my mentors like Stan Groff and James Fadiman, that I was like, okay, I'm on. And I love the path you're talking about, because there was always these guideposts right when I thought I was potentially losing it or becoming too irreverent or too disconnected. There was clinical work or scientific work or somebody reassuring me. And I think that if there's anything for your listeners to remember through these paths, is finding those keywords or guideposts that reassure you that this is my intuitive journey, this is my way.
Yeah. So how did you get introduced to, like you talked about finding Stan Groff's book early on, but did you actually meet him in person and do a mentorship or learn from him in person?
Yeah, so I'm also certified in holotropic breathwork, which he started in the early ages of Esalen, where when psychedelics were in its prohibition, he created a breathwork model that now is very, very, very important in the path of consciousness. And I ended up taking his program in the early 2000s, where I became a facilitator. And so I got an intimate chance at his workshops to participate, listen to his lectures, and then also build an intimate relationship with what he was doing in the past with his LSD psychotherapy and all his theories around that.
Mm. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that for you, psychedelics and psychology, psychotherapy, they were always integrated from the very beginning. It's not, uh, a lot of people now, there's a lot of therapists out there who are getting interested in the therapeutic use of psychedelics, who are just starting to explore, maybe at midlife after having a career as a psychotherapist, they're starting to explore the potentials of psychedelics themselves. But for you, it sounds like from the very beginning that they were hand in hand.
Yeah, they were hand in hand. And Brian, it was by happenstance. It was intuitively like I kept thinking I needed somewhere to process. So originally it was through notebooks, and then it was through my master's work. I was doing holotropic breath work in conjunction with psychotherapy and recognizing the embodied experience that breath work or yoga or meditation or these very evocative body experiences were doing, that I wanted language. And for somebody that gets to know me long enough, they'll learn I'm not short with language and I need to verbally process too.
Mm.
And so for me, a large aspect was intersecting talk therapy with these embodied experiences. And they're not limited to that. There's many different realms, but that was kind of the invitation I had towards both the integration of psychedelic work, the integration of body work, and saying, hey, processing through CBT, cognitive behavioral, dialectical, all is valuable. There's
Mm.
limits, but there's definitely value in it.
Yeah. So, on your path of becoming a psychotherapist, what were the psychological schools that called to you the most, that seemed most congruent with your psychedelic experiences and the work of Stan Groff? Were you learning transpersonal psychology, or were there other schools that you're drawing on?
Yeah, so transpersonal psychology came to me a little later. My path really unfolded with a lot of concrete sequential experience. I spent much of my early psychology work actually in child psychology and working with perception. So, watching infants and children and working with nonverbal cues of children on the spectrum. And then I graduated into communication patterns, nonverbal communication patterns. But you have to remember all along the while, I had this kind of what I would call secret because there wasn't this transparency that we live in today. And so it was as if, okay, I have this framework, but it wasn't as articulated in the open culture. And so really honing my craft of learning cognitive behavioral therapy, understanding Marshall Linehan's dialectical behavioral therapy, narrative therapy, and all these different. So I'm very eclectic in that regard. And then I was like, oh, transpersonal psychology, where has this been? And that's what led me to the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in California and going along my PhD program.
Mm. What did you do your dissertation on?
That's a great question. When I ended up doing my dissertation, I ended up looking at psychology and psychedelics, but made a beeline in finding healing and wholeness within sexuality. So I'm also a clinical sex therapist. So the intersection of psychedelics and sex, trauma, sexual healing, sexual authenticity was really percolating in me. So my dissertation is actually seeking wholeness through sexual transformation, sexual authenticity, and that was found through the work of psychedelics that I did. So it sounds quite kind of evocative, but really it's the intersection of sexual awareness and non-ordinary states of consciousness.
Well, that's really interesting. And that I think could maybe be a whole nother podcast actually, because
Yeah, we could definitely revisit because I think that's a nuance that people don't know about me and is deeply woven together. So much of psychedelic work actually is integrating our authenticity, be it sexually or our fluidity within our sexual realm. So thank you for asking.
well, yeah, sex is such a big part of life. I mean, it's the origin of life. And it's
Right?
such a part of how we identify ourselves and express ourselves and connect with ourselves and others. So that's a huge topic. And yeah, maybe one that we could follow up on actually. But I would like to keep this conversation focused in on the psychedelic integration. But let's put a pin in that maybe for a future conversation.
Sounds beautiful.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, following up on your education, what are some of the modalities that you work with primarily in your current clinical practice?
With the prohibition and the legality of psychedelics, what I do a lot of now is hypnosis. So I use a lot of classical hypnosis in the training I've done under that. I also work with breath work. So I invite clients into my office and practice, and we do holotropic breath work and different breath work models. I engage in classical talk therapy, doing much of what I would call in our culture today, we say family constellation work and reconciling, maybe reparenting. And much of that is a great, what I would say, cultivator for reconciling our psychedelic experiences. And all those are really wonderful beds of information to leap into what they've learned in their psychedelic work, what they've learned in their experiences.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you have that experiential component to your therapy practice. I know for me personally, that's been a big part of my own journey of healing and growth is having those kind of experiences, what Jung or Otto would call the experience of the numinous.
Right.
Getting in touch with the great mystery. I think Jung even went so far as to say that that encounter with the numinous was the therapy, that it was so integral to the process of individuation or transformation. So it's been important for me to also try to help facilitate those kind of experiences for people in the work I do. So I think that's really interesting that you're offering the experience and then giving it as part of a larger context.
That's accurate. And the reason I do that is because I do also believe in the space between our psychedelic experiences. And I'm a large aspect of the incubation in between and using those as launching pads for bigger psychedelic experiences. So much of the time, I'm actually processing with clients, hey, let's still do experiential exercises that we can embody. And yet, let's not assume that we're going to need a large dose of psychedelics or push into that realm of microdosing. Let's find the purity. I do have a history and a memory of that we are spirit bodies that are coming in with purity. So as much as I love plant medicines and as much as I work with them, I also don't want to be leaning into them with so much necessity that they're going to be my answer. I want to really help foster with my clients this embodied experience with their breath, with their body, with their thoughts, and reconcile that prior to going, hey, I need 5 grams or I need this large experience.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear from you because that's my view too. I think we always have had this capacity to get in touch with the great mystery on the natch, just completely
Right.
naturally, maybe through some kind of techniques or ritual structures or whatever. But we've got the kind of that capability or capacity within us already, and I love to show that to people, to kind of wake up their visionary capacity within themselves as they are now. So that's great to hear. And I love that because one of my concerns actually is that with all of the attention being placed on psychedelics these days is I think some people, what I'm hearing is that that is the path or that is the only way to go, or that is gives us the most profound or biggest experiences. And I just haven't found that to be true.
Nor have I. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, well, and I think too that when we have these experiences on the natch, they're actually a lot easier to integrate because there doesn't seem to be a kind of third element in there, or presenting us with ideas and symbols and things that are a little harder for us to integrate. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it makes 100% sense. And Brian, I would even ask in this conversation to take it further is sometimes there's this overwhelming obligation that it was supposed to have done something for us.
Right.
And so when I hear you say that, I endorse the same concerns that let's work on our body. One, it builds empowerment and strength.
Mhm.
And two, sometimes when people come into my office and say, I'm going to travel down to Peru or I'm going to go to Costa Rica for this large ayahuasca ceremony, there's a lot of pressure put on that experience
Yeah.
to either transform them, give them light into their trauma, or make some sort of transitional space for them. And when I hear that, I really kind of take on the proactive approach of cautionary expectations. Like, what are your expectations, and can we foster something without the medicine to use it as a complement, not
Mhm.
the necessity? So thank you for that like-minded idea. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's really great. That you're addressing that kind of heavy expectation that people can put on this experience. Because if someone comes out of that, they spent thousands of dollars to go to Peru to go on this 12-day ayahuasca retreat. They've drank ayahuasca, 5 or 6 times. Maybe they've done San Pedro or
Right.
Cambo or other things. They've got like all the heavy duty medicines, and they come back and they're feeling more depressed than ever, or more disconnected than ever. Like it didn't work for me. Like, and then my fear is that people then internalize that and say like, well, what the hell is wrong with me? Like I'm totally, I'm beyond help. I think there's a real danger of that. Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. And yeah, I can't help then say being gentle with each other, being gentle with their expectations. And again, that brings into integration as an intentional setting too, right? So a part of integration, as we're speaking about it, is not to forget what the purpose is, what the preparation is, what's our ideas around it, what are we doing to really do it for a motivational factor. And when I hear people say, oh, you know, I have depression that's so painful that it's suicidal, or that I feel suicidal, then there's this element of, is this the last straw? Are they worried about this? If it doesn't work, then what?
Right. Yeah. You know, I don't know if I've ever heard that tempering of expectations as part of the mindset going into it, but I think that's a really great thing to bring into it. You know, just the tempering of expectations before you go into it. That's really valuable and wise. So thanks for that.
You're welcome, and thank you.
So we're talking about integration. You know, I'm always curious to hear from other practitioners and facilitators how they define or describe psychedelic integration. So I wonder if you could offer your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the simple answer that I like to give people is taking two things and integrating them. I always imagine, in a metaphorical sense, two rivers converging. And oftentimes they get blended. And I want to help support them in recognizing that there are meaningful times that it's blended, and there's other times where we want to really compartmentalize. So integration for me is like a twofold path, that we both have to compartmentalize subject matters and also let them become fluid. And it sounds kind of nebulous, but when it's practiced, my biggest component is integrating practicality and really laying the foundation of what I would call this skin encapsulated ego, as Alan Watts would say, and then exploring the luminous, the spiritual. And those take, I think, two different roles. They can be a confluence, but they also need some time to be separated.
Hmm. So let me know if I'm hearing you right. So that there's a kind of a distinction between the experience as it can affect like behavioral change, and the experience that can open us up to the greater mystery, or the spiritual, or the transcendent.
Yeah, thank you for that translation. Spending a little bit too much time in psychedelics sometimes often gives me a little bit of a vague answer. So taking two things, we often, that can be over consuming, right? If we're faced with these luminous ideas and we're thinking, oh, the obvious is how do we bring it back to reality, right?
Right.
And that's my invitation, is sometimes some of these things are so beyond us that we're like, okay, I'd rather just not work on that. But my invitation is, we have this wonderful experience of living on planet Earth. What are we going to do with it? And how, maybe just taking pieces of it. And my biggest, again, as you said, tempering expectations, is we don't have to integrate all of our experience. Maybe it's pieces of it. Maybe we table some. And so for me, it's all about bringing it back to practicality and evoking that sense of reassurance that they can digest it, they can work with it.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is that sometimes those experiences, like the far out, transcendent experiences, it may be doing them a disservice to try to like bring them down into the mundane material world. So why not just let them be these amazing, transcendent experiences of the numinous, and let the mystery stay a mystery?
Right. Yeah. I use a term called psychointegrative. So there's a term, rather than it becoming so dissociative, right? Often when I hear them become mystery, they feel, like you alluded to a little while ago, is maybe they're not catching something, or they feel self-deprecating and they don't feel smart enough or integrated enough or evolved enough. And immediately that's a recipe for disaster. So what the psychedelic can do is take it in piecemeal, take it in substance that we can digest. that's at whatever level they feel aligned with, and then build upon it. There's always going to be room for more understanding. And I actually just spoke to a client that said, you know, the experiences I had 6 months ago, I'm still interweaving into my life. So don't be hasty to think that we're going to integrate overnight.
Oh, please don't. And
Yeah.
also, just to let you know, I last week I had a conversation with Dr. James Hollis, who's a really esteemed Jungian analyst, and he's written close to 20 books. He's been practicing as an analyst for over 40 years. He's in his 80s now. And, you know, he let me know that the work is never done. And,
Right.
you know, Jung said very much the same thing, that that process of becoming oneself, individuation, is a lifelong project that is never finished. And he,
Yeah. And Brian, oh, sorry.
no, go ahead. I was just going to say, like, he left the question open as to whether it's even finished after we die, which I love. So there's that element of the mystery too.
Isn't that the truth? And ending the conversation always with, did I attain something, is really a tragedy. So I love that he said that. I love that you said that, because if we're always trying to gain some sort of completion within, it becomes really tragic, because there's so much mystery, there's so much opportunity. And speaking about that, it's larger version of incompletion at any given moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, just it touches back to what you said about tempering expectation of the experience. Like, also temper your expectation of becoming a fully integrated individual in this lifetime. You know, like, I love like James Hillman. I was listening to a lecture of his once, and somebody in the audience asked him, like, how do we know when integration is complete, or when we've become fully individuated or something? And, you know, again, he's like in his 70s at that point, very well seasoned. He's kind of seen it all. And he says, if you ever meet a fully individualized person, send me a postcard, you know.
So much truth to it.
Because, yeah, he hadn't seen one. So, like, temper your expectations too around the integration process and making meaning of every part of your experience. I think that's really wise as well.
Thank you.
Um, Something I've been thinking about is, you know, how psychedelics have been a part of many different cultures for thousands of years. But the idea of psychedelic integration, or the necessity of psychedelic integration, is a pretty recent thing. So I'm curious what you think, why we need to focus on psychedelic integration now. What makes us different from our ancestors who used these substances?
The idea of integration, I think, has become vogue due to, I think, our culture making sure it's really focused on harm reduction. And those two words seem very synonymous. I don't believe that our ancestors or indigenous cultures don't integrate. They integrate, and they just don't need to talk about it. So to make fun of us in the westernized world, we're always making sure we think we started something new. I don't believe we did. We're just fostering it through books and ideas of kind of articulating why we're doing it. And why I say that is because I do believe we're still trying to approach it differently than, say, the 50s or 60s with harm reduction. A large aspect of my career is integrating, because people are still uncertain with what they're doing in their life. And what I mean by that is they're still evoking conversations in the world, they're still moving. And not to say people in the indigenous world and all these other cultures don't, but we're very conscious of liability, and we're conscious of being aware of, you know, trying to legalize these medicines. So why I think it's so important to integrate now is it's showing a service of, like, ruling out what's appropriate, what's not. That's just the legal aspect of things that I always want to be conscious of. But on the spiritual component, I think we're seekers. I think that hasn't left us. It's just being evoked in a different manner.
Hmm.
And I'm seeing that by a culmination of different ceremonies and the way we're inviting ceremony in and the way we're inviting therapy in is we're really evoking beautiful cultural relationship with the medicine and trying to integrate it, trying to talk with it and not think we're higher than it, right? We're not higher than the plants. We're not higher than the compounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess when I think about that question myself, like you said, like I think you touched on it, but maybe I just want to like draw it out a little more. How in the past the psychedelic integration was integrated into the culture already. So they didn't
Right.
have to think about specific practices to make sense of that experience. That experience was within a cultural context that was one understood by everyone. And it was a part of the development of the individual, like as an initiatory process or as part of their path as a visionary or healer. So it was already integrated into the culture. So there's no need for any additional integration processes. And because our culture has changed so much, and we've lost a lot of ceremony and ritual that used psychedelic substances or plant medicines, that we then have to figure out, okay, well, how can I then give this context in my life at this time in this society and culture that helps me derive some meaning from it and receive some benefit, you know?
Yeah, and Brian, what you just said really landed for me too is oftentimes integration is becoming more of a justification. Well, I did this, I need a justification for it. And I really try to evoke the opposite of that. We don't have, many times it doesn't have to kind of go to that problem solution. And I think that what you're saying around ancient cultures and cultures that really integrate it into their way of living, they don't have to have this problem solution focus or this outcome driven plan. And that's one of the biggest kind of catch 22s I talk a lot about in my practice is we don't have to be attaining anything here. We're working to integrate it. That doesn't, as you were alluding to a moment ago, solve anything or find something or finish something off. And that's, I think, one of the biggest misnomers of integration is it doesn't have to amount to any attainment. It's clarity towards wholeness, as Stan would say, but that doesn't mean that we've attained anything.
Mm. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of like Jung would say that it's not so much that we solve our problems, it's more that we outgrow them by expanding our consciousness through experience and expanding our capabilities, so developing as a person. And so there's something in what you said that I feel resonates with that idea that we're not looking at solving specific problems, but we're looking to grow so that we can understand ourselves more wholly, but also put experiences in their proper perspective, or as a like there's something I'm thinking about, like the ratio of our difficult experience versus the totality of our life potentially, and that the problems become smaller as we expand our awareness. Does that make sense? Does that ring a...
I love it. I know I really connect with it, and the idea of being able to really take it, I think, with food for thought, or not too much weight. That's also a complement towards integration, is managing what we want it to be and what it's teaching us. And oftentimes I always say, and it's pretty well known that people say, the medicines teach you what you need, not necessarily what you want. So a large aspect of integration too is saying, okay, I got something I wasn't asking for. Now what do I do with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Okay. So we talked about like psychedelic integration becoming a more in vogue thing. It's like as the interest in psychedelics comes up, then this whole industry kind of develops around that work. And so psychedelic integration providers are popping up everywhere. People are scrambling to do trainings so that they can be in on it. You know, this new wave in psychotherapy. It's like the latest trend that's rolling through our culture. And I'm often a little dismayed by the kind of superficiality of some of the stuff I see put out there by psychedelic integration providers. I think a lot of it seems to me just to be like tips that could be considered general advice for overall wellness and psychospiritual development. So what are some of the practices that you think are more specifically suited to integrating psychedelic experiences rather than just for general like wellness and development?
Well, first of all, I want to really respect what you're saying because I agree. I think right now we're living in a vacuum of exploit and excess of integration. And so everything is becoming integrated, right? That's a catchword. And so with that being said, you're exactly right. A lot of it could be used as wholeness. It could be used for a yoga practice or your meditation experience or your relationship with your partner. So with that being said, to answer your question of what is differentiated with psychedelic work versus any other holistic practice, I lean directly on that experience. What did that experience tell you? Being open to being an empathetic listener and a seeker of understanding of the innate experience. So I think what separates psychedelic integration from any other holistic integration or psychology experience is we have to look at the time you were in that world, right? The time that you were exploring the consciousness under an ayahuasca ceremony or a psilocybin ceremony. It would be very similar, Brian, to you integrating a trip to Costa Rica is much different than integrating a trip to Iceland. They're both traveled experiences, but they're going to foster and invite in different information for you. So to answer that, you have to know what you're looking at. Mm-hmm. If you're doing yoga, you're going to integrate something in your body differently than potentially a psychedelic experience that's giving you an uncanny experience of potentially something that you were unaware of. Mm. Many people have said that to me, specifically with magnificent ceremonies that are interchanged with ayahuasca. They have this condensed experience that's undescribable. Well, first we have to align what they experienced. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What that makes me think of is, I guess one of the ways I think about integration. So first of all, I think of integration as like a lifelong process, like I alluded to before, and that psychedelics can be a useful tool or experience in that larger lifelong process. So that's the way I like to contextualize the use of psychedelics, because I don't think people really experience a lot of transformation or positive change unless it's part of a larger lifestyle or part of a bigger process that involves a whole bunch of other supportive things. But one of the things like that I think about, well, how do I actually integrate that ayahuasca experience in the jungle into my life when I come back home to British Columbia? The world is so much different here. It's outside of a retreat context. I'm not in the jungle. I'm thankful to be in a rainforest, so I still get some of that nature healing. But I think about like, how can I integrate that? How can I bring that home with me so that it continues to like work on me? And the way I think about it sometimes is that what I want to do is evoke something of that experience in my daily life. So I want to be like connected to the lessons that I learned, to the experience of like magic and mystery that has been so healing for me. So I think about like, well, how can I like evoke something of that experience through all of my senses? So I've got some art from different places that I've been. Burning Palo Santo brings me back to ceremony. Listening to music from some of the healers that I worked with, or learning some of the songs and singing them myself, bring me back to those experiences in a really in a really deeply felt, visceral kind of way. Like it touches something deeply in me. So there's a resonance with that actual experience where I had like the great insight or the great healing or whatever. So that to me is like one way that I approach it, is like, just how can we evoke something of that experience when we go back home and kind of keep the healing going or keep the magic alive.
Yeah, without a doubt. And what I hear you saying, and from my vantage point, is teaching people to incrementally do it. So don't take it all in one, right? So when you talk about the five senses, I super appreciate that. When you talk about the smells versus the music versus making it accessible, but also making it incremental. So we're not trying, I think one of the disservices we do as integration therapists too, is creating this like ritual that you have to do this to integrate something. And my invitation as I'm listening to you is piecemealing it, as you said, piecemealing it together incrementally. And if it calls to you, or if you're drawn to that, use it, but don't think it's an obligation, because at the end of the day, if you think it's an obligation, you're going to be stuck. You're going to be thinking, oh, I should have done this, or I have this formulated pattern of this is what healthy integration looks like. I often will say, make it your own. Mm-hmm. So if Palo Santo serves you today, take that in. If you're drawn to being vegetarian, take that in, but don't feel it's obligatory. So I love what you're saying, but mindfully, incrementally play it out. I also think, just to kind of go deeper, is challenge yourself to do something that's out of your comfort zone. So I, being a left-handed, very right-brain thinker, would evoke art or dance. And one of my mentors once said, do different. Mm-hmm. Because we limit our integration by what we know. Mm-hmm. And so I invite the listener and people exploring psychedelic integration to challenge their comfort zones. So dance if you're not used to dancing. Journal if you're more inclined to do art. And start to practice both, bilateral brain movements and that kind of idea of comfort, pushing your comfort zone.
Oh, I think that's such great advice. Because often, the psychedelic experience or going to a ceremony does exactly that for people. And that's what I think helps them expand their perception of who they are and like what's possible for their life and, what the world is really about. So that's great. So continue to kind of push your boundaries little by little, poco a poco, in your daily life. So when you're at the retreat and you are more disinhibited, and you were able to like dance around with everybody and like kind of be the new age hippie freak and a party, you really love that. We'll see if you can like bring that into your life, and maybe like just doing it in your living room by yourself at first, but then maybe finding like an ecstatic dance party when you feel more comfortable, or if you feel more comfortable. But I love that. That's a good it's a good prompt, is to try doing differently.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it ends up bringing in some spontaneous catalysts of healing. You get that spontaneous kind of just ignition of, that fluid flow, or that, as you alluded to when you talked about the music or the Palo Santo, of that real intrinsic memory of the experience. You're like, oh, that's what that was like. That embodying it and aligning it as much as possible.
Okay, so we're similar in that we're both kind of more intuitive types, dreamy types, right? So for you, what did doing differently look like?
Great question. So because I am extremely kind of loose and I would go into drumming, or I would bring out my djembe, or I would do the art and kind of do collaging. I immediately remember practicing stillness, practicing contemplation of articulating. And that was a large aspect, to digress into the book a little bit, of the healing component for me, to do something that was, very scary and daunting, to write, to articulate my language on paper, because I was so accustomed to making it very existential and very nebulous. And I'll do an art project that will represent, or a mandala that would represent. And so by putting it into a articulate word, really always pushes my envelope of integration. And for me, it was like, I can beat the shit out of a drum all day long, but to be able to formulate what I learned or what I'm processing really up the ante, for me, because I am so right brain thinking.
Yeah, well, that was my experience too, but I never thought about it in that context before of how writing my little book, which was very much like kind of like an integration journal that I wanted to share with the world, how that was such a different kind of process for me. Like, I think I'm really good at writing a social media post or like an 800 word blog post where I can like touch into an idea, but I'm not kind of forced to string together a bunch of ideas or to more deeply articulate something that's really hard for me to express verbally. I'm less a verbal person and more of a body expressionist or a musician and that kind of thing, right? So to try and like really nail down the language in my book, which is 112 small pages and yours is almost 500 large pages, like, yeah, I get it. And that resonates with my experience too. It was one of the most challenging things I've ever done, but I think it was really good for me developmentally because it was so different from what I'm comfortable with and what I generally go to first, which is like you, the music or the art making or the kind of free expression of the feeling, right? Rather than
You're
try to
right.
like articulate it and get really careful about the words.
Yeah, and that articulation really resonates for me to say, okay, am I facing it too?
Hmm.
Because some of the real abstract things we never have to identify as, oh, I just, made this moon sun collage. But then when I actually verbalize it, I'm actually identifying with my inner relationship with feminine and masculine if I have to start then putting words to it. And that's another aspect of my endorsement for talk therapy is great.
Yeah.
I can do all the moon and sun collages that I fucking want. But if I really want to face my demon or my shadow around those elements, sometimes words are necessary. Sometimes processing it with a third party listener or healer is beneficial because they'll call you on it. They'll go, what do you think the moon and sun mean? And I'm like, freaking out because I have to identify and face that interpersonal relationship with masculine and feminine energy, maybe.
Yeah. And then like noticing if there's resistance to articulating that, like, why do I gotta make it mean anything, man? Just like
Right, 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 right,
let
right. I
let
love it.
let me be in my Mooney mode.
Exactly.
Well,
So well said.
I think what you said is like something worth to highlight as well. Like after I'd go off on my spiritual pilgrimages to go do plant medicines elsewhere, the first thing I did upon coming home was to give my wife the whole download. And that was really helpful to me to have somebody to express that verbally with. It was somehow bringing something of the experience back into my life by manifesting it through the words and my articulation, kind of helping me sort out, well, how do I even start to talk about this? But I think like there is a difference when you're working with someone like an integration coach or therapist in that you're going to get those prompting questions to look a little deeper that you might not get from your friend or your lover who's just going to be like, wow, that's amazing. Right.
Right.
Which is lovely. And that it helps you feel like, it's actually okay to express these kind of ideas out loud and all that. So there's something healing about that. But you might not get those prompts that help you look a little deeper. It's like, why does this image keep coming back up for you? And like, what is it really pointing toward? Like you said, what's in your shadow around this particular image or archetype or whatever?
It's quite beautifully said. And I think that removing those blinders are always an invitation towards wholeness and a really humble experience. I think humility comes in when we speak about integration too.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good quality to shoot for. This brings me to another question I wanted to pose to you. So What are some of the pitfalls that people should watch out for following a big psychedelic experience? What are some of the things you see in your clinic that are you would consider pitfalls?
Well, that in and of itself brings up a lot of fear in people. I think control and power is one of the largest ones. I think from my vantage point as both a witness in guided ceremony at some level and integrating with people, I see this deep desire to just hold on to say their intention, their motivational factors, and there's no wiggle room. And so they're like, I'm going to hold on to this and I'm going to own it. And it really removes them from the ability to witness and get information delivered to them.
Yeah.
The second one that comes up for me too is
Well,
what we spoke about. Go ahead,
just
please.
before you go to that, just thinking about taking it to like a next step, so that I see that a lot too. That like inability to really let go, and so someone's holding on to that intentional mantra, like it's a life preserver or something, right? And they're not allowed to. They're not allowing themselves to like let go into the ocean.
Right.
So when I think about that kind of level of control, and I often kind of ironically see this a lot with people who identify as like Buddhist meditators, they really want to like lock down the experience and like stay in one pointed concentration or something, right? And they see that as like an achievement if they've made it through the whole ceremony holding it down, right? What what that brings up for me and like where I would go with a client would be like what the control to me is like pointing toward is possibly some kind of fear around overwhelmment.
100% agree with you. 100% agree with you. And then it questions more of the safe set and setting that they've asked for, they want to, and that overwhelming. This is what are they afraid of? Like you said, I love that you said the Buddhist monk. I can just picture it now as just trying to hold it down. And at the 4 hour and 25 minute mark, they're like, yeah, I survived.
Yeah, I did it.
Right. And that's what happens. I mean, and not to make it comical, but that does happen is they're like, and then I'm like, well, what do you integrate? I'm just glad I'm through it. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah, or it's a proof of some kind of attainment in their meditative practice.
And not only
Right? Like I met that challenge and I defeated, I defeated ayahuasca by like.
And, and we could digress, but I beg that's the new renaissance too, is this taking Terence McKenna's 5 gram heroic dose and turning it into 10. And I'm like, what are you trying to attain? I think power and control, as you're speaking about pitfalls, Brian, is also managing the ego. Like, so what you can say now you went to do your ayahuasca ceremony and I'm not being blasphemous to it. We all do it. I mean, I'll throw myself under the bus. Sometimes I'm like, I just want to recreationally do it. But at the same time, we have to know what it is to surrender and explore. When is it appropriate to surrender and when is it exploring the limits of our ego?
Mm-hmm. Now you're going to say, you're going to talk about kind of a second pitfall that you see.
The expectations of, and one of the things that really lately has concerned me is coming in as it being a last ditch effort. And we peripherally talked about it earlier, but to really put emphasis on it, Brian, is individuals that are seeing psychedelic medicine as the end all be all proverbial silver bullet. And they walk in and they're talking about it. They're saying, hey, I've just signed up to go down south. I've got this amazing experience to be in protocols or certain research. And they're just assuming, they're making a radical assumption that because they're going to take these medicines, that things are going to change. And one of the largest pitfalls to exacerbate this conversation more is you're becoming understanding that trauma doesn't leave you. And oftentimes people are like, well, they're wanting it if they're doing ketamine infusions or anything. They're wanting depression to snap and go away. Mm-hmm. They're wanting the post-traumatic stress of their trauma to go away. And to be the grim reaper of saying, I understand your struggles, I empathize and compassion with you, but please know that you're going to learn to live with it. You're going to learn to have more awareness around it, appreciate it potentially. But I can't guarantee or even consider telling you that that trauma is going to go away, or that memory is going to go away, or you're going to be healed and depression. We don't want to cut emotional wheels out, or emotional parts of the wheel out, or memories of that's developed who you are.
Yeah.
And
yeah. We don't want to eradicate,
bad.
we don't want to eradicate fear or anxiety because they actually help you survive.
Right. You're well said.
Yeah. I think if anyone suggests to you that you're going to be free of any of your suffering after coming to the retreat or doing that particular medicine, whatever, I think the best advice I can give is run the other way, because you're dealing with someone who doesn't know their own shadow or is not willing to admit they have one. One of the things that's been so helpful for me in doing this podcast and talking to elders who've been doing the work a lot longer than you or I is this affirmation that the work is never done, that the trauma, the childhood experience is always going to be within us. That's incredibly comforting to me, and also a little distressing, because a part of me just wishes that at some point I'm not going to be triggered anymore. Like I had a yoga teacher who was important to me. He would always talk about if you do this practice enough, that you're going to get into a state of non-reactivity. And he would claim that he had no shadow, that he was completely free of any shadow, any ill intent or anything. Like he thought of himself as a purified being, and he would sell a simple yoga practice as being the path to that level of attainment. And, I found out through my own dealings with him that all of that wasn't true. Of course, he had a shadow. He just wasn't willing to admit it. And it got expressed in all kinds of distorted ways, right?
Right.
But there is this ideal out there in our culture right now, and fairly prominent with certain teachers, that you can get to this state of absolute peace and non-reactivity. And I think of that often as a carrot on the end of a very long stick. And that stick just keeps getting longer and longer. And so in the kind of pre-psychedelic Renaissance spiritual world, we saw a lot of this in people just getting like obsessed about spiritual practice, jumping from one tradition to another, like looking for that silver bullet that you talked about. And I see the same kind of patterns in this psychedelic renaissance now, where it's either doing more of one medicine, so getting larger and larger cups of ayahuasca, or going to the next level with particular substances. Like it starts with mushrooms, then we got to go to the next level with ayahuasca, and then we got to go to the next level with like pure DMT and all this. And I think it's really dangerous, but it gets perpetuated, I think, in our social media culture, where maybe the only thing you see about somebody's experience is this trip report where they've just talked about how it's completely changed their life, and it can give you a kind of false impression of the real kind of effect that had on that person. And what we often see is that, a lot of those people have some kind of like some burnout or a spiritual emergency down the road. But if you go from like that one report, it might give you completely unrealistic expectations of what these medicines can provide.
Without a doubt. Yeah, I think especially I love that you're talking about the ancestors and our elders, because an element that needs to be made is there's a lot of younger generations that don't have the emotional intelligence or the ability to articulate what they're observing and translating it. They have an assigned meaning of thinking they should do that because they hear, a certain figurehead say they did that, so you should do that, or there's an influencer that did this. And they're encapsulating it in a very, very, very small container. And it's our job as practitioners and people helping to educate in the form of awareness, tempering expectations, harm reduction, set and setting. And I don't want to be sounding like a prudent or like this, Ryan, you sound like just a double-edged sword or, walking hypocrisy. But
Yeah,
at
why
the end
is
of the
it
day,
okay for you to be a free explorer and all this, right? Well,
exactly.
but also like my perspective is, look, you can learn from my mistakes. I had to do a lot of healing after some of those traumatic early experiences,
Right.
The memories are still there for me, really present. Like they're really tough experiences because I didn't have any education around set and setting and all that.
Right. And I love what you said about that, because we are humble enough to say, hey, we're just passing on what we know and take it with a grain of salt, and leading into what is your expectation, what is your trauma, processing it, learning to make it an understandable subject matter too. To be able to just simply talk about it is radical healing. Many people will say that to me. I've never spoken these words in my entire life. That I have to slow people down and say,
That's huge.
that's huge. Exactly. That is
Yeah.
huge. We don't need another 5-gram dose of mushrooms to go at it harder. Let's just sit with how powerful, courageous, and vulnerable you are in that state.
Mm. And the ability to acknowledge something, to talk about it, to be with it, uh, that is healing. Like, I don't know if there's another level to that. Maybe we get more and more able to be with those experiences. Like
Yeah.
I said, we grow larger and larger, hopefully, so that those experiences have less power over us, but they're still there. And actually, one of the things I found is that those experiences never leave me, and sometimes the triggers are still there, depending on the situation. But because of how much I've grown over the past, 46 years, I'm actually able to see a lot of those experiences, things that built my character, and in some ways have become gifts because they've made me uniquely me. And I appreciate that more and more, being a unique person that may not fit in everywhere and accepting that and actually kind of celebrating that.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. That's so beautiful.
Thanks. Um, a couple more questions, and this is related to how we kind of process experience. So, when someone comes to you and they describe an interaction with an entity, maybe something like, you mentioned becoming a vegetarian earlier. So I've heard this before. Ayahuasca told me that I must be a vegetarian. Or that I must stop eating hamburgers or whatever it is. But I thought often of making a t-shirt, a tourist t-shirt for Iquitos that says ayahuasca told me.
Right. I love it. It'd be perfect.
So when someone comes to you with an experience of this entity, I wonder like how you approach that. Like, do you personally consider them autonomous entities, or do you think that they're projections of the unconscious? And is it important for you to discern that with the client or yourself?
To answer the question, I'm going to first establish a deep sense of rapport and seeking understanding before I try to qualify, is this an autonomous entity? Is this a projection of their unconscious? Or is this a manifestation of their non-ordinary state experience? I want to really, really connect with the person and allow them to feel unjudged. Mm-hmm. So that it might sound obvious, but so often people are like, they start the statement of, I just saw machine elves, or I just saw my dead grandmother's brother's sister playing out some storyline. And then they go, and I feel crazy saying it. So I have to endorse, reassure, and hold space of non-judgment. And I ask everybody to go, okay, I'm going to hear this information without trying to discern or make sense of it. And oftentimes that's the person's knee-jerk reaction. They need to find what makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I'm completely understanding of that, Brian, and I get it. But without non-judgment and without this kind of safe space, people are going to go, I just had that experience. They won't even be able to feel safe to tell it. Is it their projections, or is it, that's for them to kind of keep working into? I'm not going to try to, weasel my way out of your question, but I've gone from being like the most spiritual kamikaze focused on Zen Buddhism to esoteric Hindu cultures to more Tibetan Buddhisms to Christianity to, naturalists, that I'm still curious. So I want to listen. And then I'm like, okay, well, what does it mean to you? Mm. What's it mean to you? And I think finding a semblance of their assigned meaning helps them become reassured. I am not clinically savvy enough to say, oh, well, the brain is telling you this, and this is what's lighting up in the cortex. But what I do know is it's true. If someone sees their dead grandmother and they're missing them, and you're witnessing them weep in a 3.5-hour MDMA session, and they said they saw their dead grandmother, I am not going to fucking question that, and nor do I deserve to pretend like I know what I'm talking about. That's theirs, and I want to reassure them that that's their truth.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm with you on that. And like from a personal standpoint, at this point, I'm like totally agnostic about it all, because psychologically, I can understand how these things could be a projection of my unconscious. But I've had experiences where, I don't know, very weird stuff happens with real effects in this so-called material world. So I'm agnostic like you. But I guess like one of the things that I've just kind of been sitting with lately is wondering that at a certain point, is it helpful for us to consider that these things might be a projection of our unconscious, so that we can better understand what's in our shadow, and maybe take some ownership of the power or the kind of like unwanted aspect of what we might be projecting onto like a goddess figure or a protector figure or a demonic figure. At some point I think like, well, yeah, and it's something I'm just kind of wondering about, and I'm here with you and seeing what you think. But
I want to
not be helpful at some point to just to kind of work with that and yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm grateful for your repositioning of the question, because the way you say it in that regard, there is a necessity for a clinician to support you in saying, hey, that could be an archetype, or helping psychoeducate them on, oh, you saw an elephant with 3 hands and talking to you on, a river. Maybe I could direct you to the Ganesh. Maybe you could start to evoke these archetypes. I had a client once, and this was a real concern, was they had gone to a Grateful Dead concert, and they came back with their skin being blue after taking LSD. And I tell this story because I had to tell him his skin wasn't blue. And so we had to go into what, like you said, was a projection of his unconscious. And I'm appreciative of you opening this dialogue, because there are times where we have to say, no, you can feel that your skin's blue or that something happened, but we need to help support you and back to the reality of what it is. Even though he thought his hand was blue, his skin was blue, we had to kind of reframe and take into consideration westernized medicine, helping him kind of find his equal rhythm. So thank you for that.
Yeah, your skin's not blue. And what does this archetype of Vishnu mean to you, or whatever, right? Or
exactly, right? Isn't that? I mean, and that's where we went. But
yeah, or the fear around like drowning or suffocation. These kind of that's what it's the image is evoking in me. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I automatically start getting curious about these things,
Yeah.
and just to offer them up as like inquiries with the person without saying, clearly this was a hallucination or
Right, giving consent and asking for consent to kind of make observations or thoughts on it is super important. I agree with you.
That's great. I love your kind of like sensitive and careful approach with people. I really appreciate that.
Well, otherwise, I would have been locked up 15 years ago if I didn't have that same sensitivity. It would have been like, you saw a wolf doing what? Goodbye. So,
Yeah. I'd be next door to you, I think.
right. Treat others how you would want to be treated.
Yeah, totally. Um, okay, so just to finish up, on the podcast, when I talk to people like you, I always like to draw out some like real practical tips that people can start to implement in their life. So, what are a few of the kind of essential tips or practices that you recommend to people working with psychedelics?
One of the most important ones I endorse with my clients is what I call a three lock approach, Brian. And that's following the intuition of unlocking your emotional, your physical body, and your cognitive thoughts. And to digress into one or the other sometimes can get people stuck. So if they're only trying to integrate what they theoretically thought, and they are like, oh my gosh, and they get caught up in the cognitive distortion of thinking, and not allowing in maybe an emotional response that they had in the psychedelic session, or a physical embodied sensation of tingling or peace. Or I always ask them to look at all three, because maybe what they're missing is that interaction between the three and giving them information to take home. The quickest and most eloquent way to kind of lose traction in your psychedelics is if you attempt to go, okay, I got this and I know this, and not look at the holistic approach of your heart, your body, and your thoughts together.
Hmm. And I think that's great because that in itself is a level of integration of self.
Right. And it's very intuitively driven, because many people, as you are well aware of, might have an overly processed experience cerebrally, which then they forget what it was like as they walked away from the experience in their body. Or maybe they have this resounding tinge of anxiety in their heart that they didn't listen to because it was so profoundly visual. And so I want to make sure we're not missing any of those elements.
Hmm. I wonder if it would be helpful if you could offer an example of that, or maybe even demonstrate with me, just to give people an idea of how they might lead themselves through that process.
That would be great. So, how I will do it, so we don't bring in any specific storyline, I would just invite someone to think of a cup of coffee. And in the morning, our physical body is going to ask us and unlock saying, I would like a cup of coffee. Our emotional heart might say, I love a cup of coffee. And our thoughts might also be aligned to make all three unlocked by saying, I love coffee in the morning. Well, for certain people, at 10 o'clock at night, I ask that very same question. Their emotions still might be aligned that they love coffee. And if they listen to it and ignore their physical body and what caffeine does to them at 10 p.m., they're doing a disservice to their integrative approach. They're only listening to one of the three. And so if you eloquently then say, okay, I love coffee, I unlock it, but go into then your body and say, what will my body do at 10 p.m. drinking coffee? You'll quickly see it's locked and it will say, don't go there. I'm not ready to.
Mm.
What that looks like for psychedelic integration is you have to listen to what your body's pushing back against. Yeah, everybody thinks you have to lean into resistance, but you also have to know when it's not appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe it's down the road that you face that storyline. Maybe you process it verbally first. Maybe you engage in it with some experiential body exercises like breath work or yoga. Does that help with kind of conceptualizing what that looks like in the theoretical sense?
Yeah, totally. I appreciate you saying that about resistance because it is kind of a meme that's out there is that we gotta uh, push up against or break through our resistance no matter what. And I really caution people because sometimes the resistance is a protective mechanism that's there for a damn good reason. So also like trusting the intelligence of your system.
Yeah, right. And which leads me into another practical skill is just be conscious of being gentle. The end
Mm.
of my book is the last thing I say is be gentle. Is don't. It's there. And you said it really eloquently. Pushing up against that, it might be a defense mechanism or there for a purpose. Don't ignore your intentions, don't ignore your intuition and listen to, and don't think you need to go at it going 150 miles an hour.
Mm. Yeah. That's great. I think that's a beautiful note to end it on. Go gently, be courageous in your exploration of yourself in the world, but go gently and carefully, and hopefully with a good, caring, thoughtful guide as well.
Highly important is being safe with the people and knowing that they have their education, their experience, their trust in you. Relations are super important. I think specifically now more than ever, if you don't feel safe or have that energetic flow with somebody, that tells you should you be doing it or is this an appropriate time, because there could be so much at stake emotionally, physically, psychologically. So
Mm.
I appreciate this time today. It's really a beautiful conversation. I love your work.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really happy with how it went. I think we drew out some good stuff. Um, Now, if I know that you're doing some different things, you're doing some work on Zoom. You've got this handbook, which is just to let people know. I think, like the way that I perceive it, it's a very comprehensive overview of everything that could be involved in your own individual integration process. And it seemed like you wanted to introduce people to a lot of different concepts and practices and approaches. Is that correct?
That's accurate. So the design and the makeup of it is both giving educational background of a lot of the information, both historically that psychedelics brings, but as you eloquently do in your podcast, is bringing it back to skill-based too and giving some action. So I designed the book intentionally to have a white notebook. You can get it dirty, draw on it, make it a journal. There's integrative exercises at the end of each chapter so you could process. And it's not designed to read just once, but as an evolutionary of your process. And not because I'm sadistic, but because I'm curious. I ended it with death. So I really find the transformation, the mystery of the next journey as an opportunity that psychedelics really helps present for us. So there's an opportunity to really make it your own. Maybe you don't read the book all straight through. You pick a chapter and it really resonates. And that's the intention.
Yeah, that's great, and that it is so the kind of comprehensive. Different things in the book might resonate with people at different times in along their journey. So you may look at it a couple of years from now and go, "Ooh, actually, that practice seems like it's the right thing for me now." So I think it's just great that you guys did the work of creating a very robust and comprehensive handbook that provides a very kind of like broad overview rather than your personal opinion of what works best, which was my book. That's why it's only 112 pages, because it's very much about integrating yoga with plant medicines and psychedelics.
Oh, so beautiful though, and deeply necessary. I think at the end of the day, everybody makes it their own, and that's what I want to keep really advocating for. And it seems very important to be able to bring those two together.
Yeah, great. So are you doing any online workshops or anything around this?
Yep. So thank you for asking. I'm doing three things right now. I'm doing dream work as a psychedelic integration process. So
Mm,
much. I
perfect.
created a little bit of a dream work experiential group exercise that has translated quite well online. And then I also am doing a digital detoxing group as it relates to psychedelic integration. And the reason I'm doing that is, as you know, is my book isn't digital. It's a robust book of 5 pounds. And I intentionally did that because I have a unique relationship with the digital world. And so I want people to kind of come into contact with what is a lived experience of psychedelic integration and evoking that. So those are 2 workshops right now. And another one that I do is a classic representation of that 12-chapter book, where each chapter is designated per week, and we evoke really intentional focus on that chapter.
Oh, that's great. So it's almost like a study group for the handbook.
Yeah, accurate. Very accurate. Yep.
Well, study handbook, but also, like you said, experiential, because I'm guessing that you go into the different exercises that you present in the book.
100%. And the idea behind it is then they can take it and actually see it, as we talked about in today's conversation, manifested in the real world, where really my motivation is bring it into practicality. What does it mean to you and how can you do it? So if you're doing a mandala drawing, or if you're doing a yoga practice, or if you're doing your obituary, then you're recognizing, wow, I learned something and I saw the interwoven nature of it as it relates to psychedelics or their experience.
Yeah, great. So if people want to find out about all of this, where can they go?
Thank you. My website is Healing Souls, SOULS, LLC.com, healingsoulsllc.com, or psychedelicintegration.net. And I have 2 websites, and they both kind of confluence back into who I am and what I'm doing. Many of the conversations are very open. I have a forum on the Healing Souls website that gives people kind of an interaction of what I'm doing with blogs, comments, and inviting in that kind of workshop and communal tribe that we're creating.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for spending time with us today and sharing your perspective. I really appreciate it. And I feel a lot of resonance with you personally. So it just feels good on a personal note, nourishing for me.
Yeah, and particularly because we live in such an isolated time that it means the world to me, and I'm deeply humbled by the invitation. And again, would love to talk at any level about this. It never gets old, and it really keeps bringing more and more to the table. Thank you for doing it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And maybe we've got a conversation down the road about sex, because it's one of my favorite topics that I haven't covered too much on the podcast.
Would be honored. Would be honored. Brian, it's a privilege.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
You too.